So for those of you who are not at the keynote this morning, I should mention that what this session is about is Q&A. So I'm not going, the slides I have here are the presentation I gave this morning. I have them so that I can refer back to them based on whatever questions you might have. But this is not a presentation session. It's discussion and Q&A. So if that is not what you were expecting and you feel like standing up and walking out right now, feel free. You won't hurt my feelings. That's okay. But otherwise, I guess I first of all would invite anybody who would like to move a little closer up if you feel like it, so this can be more of a discussion. And I would just invite whoever would like to kick us off with something that struck you this morning and what I said, or a question you have about anything that I mentioned, or a question that you'd like to float for us to discuss as a group, and invite other participants who are here today to comment on. So, with that, who would like to be the starter? Yes, in the back.
I've been sitting a lot, so I'm going to stand for a minute.
Okay. Maybe should we pass around a mic? Maybe because if this is being recorded, the questions need to hear. So I'll just run around the room and let you hold this mic to ask your question.
So my question is, this morning you had mentioned something about don't try this in front of customers, try it in front of employees, and I just wanted you to elaborate on, reasons why that might not be a good idea.
Sure, happy to. So the fundamental reason is that right now, generative AI is not reliably accurate, as we know. So-called hallucinations still happen. The word hallucination is a little bit misleading. I'd rather just call them errors or inaccuracies, but that's the lingo. So let's call them hallucinations. So I guess you have to ask yourself, what happens when there's a hallucination, when there's an inaccuracy? If the user has enough knowledge and enough expertise to detect it, then they can override it and say, well, that's wrong. But usually when people ask a question, it's because they don't know the answer. And unfortunately, or for better or for worse, generative AI tends to have a very high degree of linguistic fluency. Right? When it says something, the words that come out are really nice. ChatGPT is a better writer than most humans I know. It's not especially colorful or brilliant, but it's well written, it's clear, a little boring, but still it's consistent, and so that's really helpful. But as humans, when we ask each other questions, when we don't know the answer, so we can't fact check it, so we tend to use the answerer's linguistic fluency as kind of a proxy for whether or not they're an expert. If I ask you a question on something you know about, and you seem to talk about it real good, I'm going to be likely to trust you. ChatGPT talks real good about too many things, about everything. So then what that means is that it's better used as kind of a whisperer, like in a contact center scenario where agents would see suggestions or recommendations about what to say to an end customer, but would have the judgment and the critical thinking and the expertise to be able to essentially treat it as a reminder, like, oh, that's a helpful reminder of what I could say, or, no, I'm not going to say that, that's not useful, it's in the background, as opposed to direct real-time interaction with a customer. So that's one sort of big reason. The other is maybe a little bit more Machiavellian, which is that employees are more captive than customers. The switching costs for employees, quitting and joining a different company, are very high. That's a kind of complicated thing to do compared to a customer switching brands, which there are some switching costs to that, but not as high. So if you're going to do something that's risky, where you might screw up and you might really annoy the user, it's better for that user to be an employee than a customer, because they'll likely be more forgiving, be more willing to overlook for longer the problems that you're causing by using a system that is committing these errors or so-called hallucinating. Does that make sense? Sure. Other comments or thoughts about this or anything else? Yeah. Let me bring the mic to you.
So not sure if you stayed for a lot of the customer showcase part, and like us, most of the people who did showcase did have it out to members, to our end users. So what would your take be on, because we can't take it away, because it's actually resonating pretty well with our membership, what would your advice be or approach we should be taking to ensure that we don't fall into some of those pitfalls that you just mentioned?
Well, first of all, it depends on how high the stakes are. So I did give one example, an example of where using generative AI in real-time customer-facing interactions was appropriate, the 1-800-Flowers example. And of course, that's sort of at one extreme where there's basically zero risk, and then the other extreme would be very high-risk scenarios where you would definitely not want to be doing that. On the other hand, humans make mistakes too, and yet we hire humans. You know, if you decided you were never going to hire an entity unless it were 100% accurate and never made errors, you would not hire any people either. And so how do we do that? How do we overcome it? We look at people's track records in the form of their resume, and we look at their pedigree, which is also typically in a resume. We verify those things, typically with some reference calls. And then once they're hired, we monitor their performance. And if they perform well, we give them more responsibility. If they don't perform well, we try to give them some coaching and some training, hopefully. And if that doesn't work out and they're still not performing well, we fire them. And the same approach is appropriate for AI. Monitor and either promote to more responsibility or fire the AI after some coaching and training if that doesn't work. So in the situation you're talking about where, yes, I did see some of what came after my talk and then I had to step out, but in some of those scenarios, if end users are responding positively, and I really mean responding positively through some kind of a customer sat survey or something like that, not just whether, sometimes task completion is measured using proxies that I think are really not accurate, like the bot thinks it identified the intent, but there's no evidence that it in fact did. But if you really have reliable measures that indicate that customers are happy and you're helping people at a satisfactory rate, then there's no reason to pull it, but it's important to continue monitoring in exactly that way. So, you know, there are cases, but I would say right now they're the minority, where real-time interactions are appropriate. At the same time, there are different kinds of real-time interactions. I spoke with someone earlier today who was giving an example of how his company, as he described it, is using generative AI for real-time interactions with customers. But it turns out what he meant is in real time presenting content to users which was generated by generative AI, but previously, and which then had been vetted by a subject matter expert. So there is generative AI in the pipeline that resulted in the content that is being shown to the customer, but it's not happening in real time. So there's sort of some subtle gray areas in there. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. Thank you. Sure. Other question? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sure. So what is the best approach to coaching end users to use generative AI? For example, let's say a radical change happened from a category menu or DTMF, and then we have the generative AI of how can I help you? And the majority of the end users, you know, based on, you know, socioeconomics, based on age, based on everything, become resistant to the usage of Gen AI. How could we coach them in the most practical way to optimize the usage of Gen AI in this case?
So I'm curious about that question because in general, you know, specifically the part where you said some users are sort of reluctant or resistant to using generative AI, because in some cases, in a lot of cases, it seems to me people are too willing to use generative AI. For example, you know, I talked this morning about the guy who was getting advice from ChatGPT about how to parent his teenage son, a little too willing. His mental model was too trusting. What are the situations that you're talking about where there's not trust, where there's suspicion about generative AI?
Yeah, so the suspicion, let's give an example of like a pizza place where they wanted just to talk to a person and then order their pizza instead of using the IVR system to place the order. And every time, you know, the just agent, human, worker, front desk, etc. How do we coach them to just trust into the AI and, you know, place the order using it, or, you know, in any other business sort of situation? But that's just an example.
Right. Yep. I see. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. So I would say that's a problem that sort of goes beyond generative AI and even beyond AI. You know, consumers in general are not happy with or confident about automation solutions like IVRs. So if something sounds like an IVR or seems like it's going to be a chatbot, their confidence level is low. I mean, ChatGPT has helped restore some confidence in chatbots over the past 18 months, but they still have a bad reputation. In fact, when I was doing a bunch of research interviews for a series of reports that I wrote about chatbots a few years ago, it was interesting to me that some of the technology providers I spoke with said they'd prefer I not use the term chatbot because chatbots had a bad reputation. They preferred virtual assistant. And I can understand that point of view, but I think the way to restore their reputation is to make them work better, not just use a different name, because a different name will just give virtual assistant a bad reputation as well. So I think the only way to, so first of all, it's important to know what the user's mental model is of what's going on. And in the case of chatbots, often the mental model includes does not work. Chatbots have been frustrating to me in the past. And there's a lot of evidence about the mismatch there. Forrester conducted a survey recently that found that, I remember these numbers because I wrote about them, 71% of companies have deployed a chatbot in some form, but only 16% of consumers actually have reached out to a chatbot for help in the past 6 months. So 71% versus 16, that's pretty low. Then there's another number in there that's interesting. 58% of consumers had actually tried a chatbot. So it's not that people weren't trying it. The idea of a chatbot is really appealing, being able to interact using natural language. I mean, of course we would like that. The way we interact with other humans is using natural language, not by clicking buttons and selecting from menus on each other. We talk. So the idea of being able to talk or type with a bot is really attractive. So hence the 58% number. That's a lot of enthusiasm among consumers actually trying it. But then only 16% actually using it to get help indicates that there's disappointment, that it's underperformed. So then it becomes kind of a question of reputation management. How do you restore the reputation? And I think there it has nothing to do with generative AI specifically. It's more just trying to build a good track record, trying to invite users to engage in ways that demonstrate competence immediately, and doing it with smaller scope. I mean, you gave the example of a bot that says, "How can I help you?" In general, I think it's actually not a good idea for a bot to say, "How can I help you?" For a human to say, "How can I help you?" is great. That's a wonderful employee who would say that. But when a bot says, "How can I help you?" it's setting very high expectations, which it probably cannot meet. Unless it says, "How can I help you? These are the 3 things I can do. Reset your password," whatever. But if it just says, "How can I help you?" And I've interacted with a bunch of bots that do that, you tend to think, if you haven't used it a lot, "Oh, wow," and you ask a question that seems relatively simple, and it often can't handle it. I guess there are some things in the design of the experience that would be about setting low expectations, or setting very precise expectations, which would be lower than most of them are nowadays, and then just knowing that it's going to take a while. There's no silver bullet for overnight restoring the reputation of chatbots. I think one of the problems, this came up again and again in my research about this, companies I spoke with who had deployed chatbots said that the mistake they had made was treating it purely as an IT project and not having people who understand conversation design and UX, not realizing that that's a huge part of it. Thinking, "Oh, what is there to design? It's just a bot. So what is it? The choice of typeface and the color of the bubbles?" But of course, UX and design are not just about the surface appearance. It's about the interaction, the architecture of the back and forth, the dialogue, understanding the language that underlies the assumptions, the type of language that people are going to use, the structure of conversations, notions from linguistics like conversation repair, where it's totally normal between humans to say things that are ambiguous. And we have ways of disambiguating by asking people to say a little bit more, or giving them sort of multiple choices. Do you mean this or do you mean that? Those are sophisticated things that we do as humans completely intuitively, and that bots need to learn to do, and that not that many of them are that competent at doing currently. And developers may be super smart and very good at what they're doing, but don't necessarily have a background in understanding some of those notions from linguistics that somebody who does would be able to help with. So there's a need for more collaboration on that front. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we hear about these guardrails that every company is trying to come up with to sort of soften the blow, if you will, of all the issues that we have with an LLM. How effective are these guardrails? Will it help, or if you can speak to that?
The guardrails that are in place are better than nothing, but they're not 100% effective. I mean, they're valuable, but the thing is, often they themselves are kind of rules-based, based on detecting certain keywords or certain topics that are being addressed. And there's obviously risk involved when that happens. So I would say it's risk mitigation, not risk elimination. So it really just becomes still the same calculation of can we afford to take this risk? We're just reducing it slightly. Yep.
That 16% that you mentioned, which use cases actually match or fit better those success stories?
What do you mean? Which
Use cases.
Use,
What sort of interaction with the chatbot have been basically the most successful?
so in that 16% case, these were situations where a customer was using a website or app and needed help with something. So it could have been completing a purchase or service, anything across the life cycle. Is that what you're asking about?
Do you, based on your research,
Yeah.
did you see a pattern that?
Oh, I see. What part of the? No, I don't have data about that specifically. No. Yep.
First of all, thank you for the morning presentation. And one thing which really stood out for me when I work for Flow to Blue is the whole idea of being consider AI as an employee, but do not put them in front of your customer. Right. That was really resonating in many scenarios. From your research, or when do you think? I mean, what needs to happen before we can really use this in front of a customer? Because I understand the employee side of it, definitely productivity tools and all of those things, it helps. But before we put it in front of customer, what needs to happen?
I think the question to ask is, how do you decide when a human is ready to put in front of a customer? Right? I mean, how do you decide that? You probably, if you think about your own colleagues right now, you can probably think of some who are really great in front of customers, and you just hope you can get them into every pitch or every situation where there needs to be a customer interaction. And there are other employees who you may think are really competent at some things, indispensable, but you would never want them in front of customers, or they'd be a last resort choice. And so I think all you have to do is think about, what are your criteria for deciding that, and the same thing would apply to AI.
It's more from the enterprises, like people who create OpenAI or Google's bot or any of these things, right? Yeah. What's the next evolution for them so that it can reach to that kind of a trust? That it's from their angle.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think the higher the risk case, the more important it is for there not to be inaccuracies. And the way to eliminate the inaccuracies, there are several ways of doing that. One is by having a higher quality corpus. If the corpus contains no inaccuracies and the temperature is set to 0, then in principle, you shouldn't have any inaccuracies coming out. But cleaning a corpus completely so that it has no inaccuracies is tricky. It's feasible if you have a small corpus, but if it's small, it's not statistically large enough to be really useful for creating a model. If it's large enough to create a model, it's impractical to have humans comb through the whole thing and make sure it's all accurate. So it's a little bit of a shot in the dark, or I should just say, it's a little bit of a gamble in terms of the quality of what's in the corpus. There are research efforts for actually editing models. There's a research effort called ROME, R-O-M-E. It's an acronym, I forget what it stands for. And the idea is to be able to edit facts in a model, identifying specific areas of model that contain facts and editing them. It's very, very early stages, though, and honestly, I'm very skeptical. It sounds exciting, but I'm very skeptical that that kind of thing is going to work just because of the nature of how neural networks are architected and the way they function. The other things that companies are working on that make sense are not modifying the model, but modifying what goes into the context by doing, injecting something in the prompt prior to what the user types, or whether it's not necessarily types because it could be some other medium, but whatever input the user provides. And then the other place to intervene would be once the output is generated, using guardrails, filters. So they're kind of those three main places sort of in the interaction. I guess I would add the one other is the coaching and training, right? Using things like reinforcement learning from human feedback. So those are the main areas that come to mind as the things that are likely to make LLMs and Gen AI more reliable and therefore more likely to be usable for real-time customer interactions that are higher stakes. So as of the example I gave this morning last year, the 1-800-Flowers bot that generates haikus and limericks for your mom, done, that's fine, that's behind us, easy. The LLM that you're gonna trust to, as we were saying earlier, generate the procedure for, doing a filling on one of your molars, or that's going to advise a cardiac surgeon on what the procedure should be for your heart, that's far in the future, if ever. And then there's a whole bunch of cases in between, right? And I think the more we're able to do, make progress in those 4 areas that I've mentioned, the closer we'll get to trusting them more. But again, it's a little bit similar to humans. I had a surgery a couple months ago, and I didn't really understand what the doctor told me about what he was going to do. I listened, and I understood some of it, but then there was some trust involved. Why did I trust him? Well, reputation, track record, pedigree, kind of what I was saying, right? So I was sort of the user who had to trust the output from the entity that in this case happened to be a human doctor. So I had to use other criteria. He's not like a database or a spreadsheet or a piece of software. There's some trust involved based on those factors. And I think over time, Gen AI systems will develop very gradually that kind of trust. But trust isn't built, overnight. Yeah, it's not. It's going to be very gradual.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just going to go over here. There's a question. I'll come back.
So you talked about trust, right? I think data is very key in actually what we have to do. And governance as an aspect is now getting shifted back to now it's called AI governance from how the data is defined, right? And the taxonomy. What do you think in your experience actually that's going to impact with all the Gen AI and everything that's going on us? Yeah, in trust and everything else, right? Because the data is key to what we are building with AI. If data is not right, but a lot of the focus is now given to AI, but the focus on the data is actually losing its credibility with a lot of companies.
Well, I would say, one of the things I mentioned this morning on that front is that data management and cleanliness is more important than ever for exactly that reason. Because it's one thing, most companies have internal knowledge bases that are pretty messy, that are a morass of information that some of which is useful and correct, some of which was maybe correct 5 years ago, but isn't anymore because the product line has changed and so on. But that kind of messiness, they sort of live with having humans who slowly filter out and don't follow some of those things. But as soon as you introduce automation, then any error gets magnified very quickly. If an individual human contact center agent relies on an incorrect piece of information and misleads one customer, you might get that 1 or maybe 10 unhappy customers. But if you have an automated system, an AI, that relies on the incorrect piece of information, it could mislead 1 million customers in 1 minute, and then your brand is in the headlines, and you've really destroyed a lot of trust as opposed to just having a tiny little impact. So it feels like governance would apply to 2 things there. One, data, governing the cleanliness of the data, how it's used, but then also how the Gen AI itself is used for what kinds of decisions. What's the gravity of the decision? What's the risk? But it being very important to make it explicit how it should be used, because, as I mentioned also this morning, the Forrester client who admitted to me the little secret she didn't tell any of her colleagues, which is that she was using ChatGPT on her home computer to generate drafts of letters to customers and so on that were being sent out to hundreds of thousands of customers. And the reason she was being secretive is because IT thought they were doing the right thing by banning Gen AI, saying it's too risky, which is kind of like, as I said this morning, it's like when IT banned smartphones and said BlackBerries only. Not a recipe for success. So governance and guardrails are the way, not bans. And since I already went to you, I'm going to go to some people in the back who are raising hands.
Thank you. That was a great talk this morning. Thank you so much. Question for you, and this is a little bit left field, but I wanted to get your thoughts on it. What do you think about, so Gen AI as a technology is great. We know what it can do. But so there is a way you can intervene from an output of a public model. Where do you see purpose-built models going? Is there, would there, purpose-built models? So if you have like healthcare models, you have other kind of models, and would there be in future ever a marketplace of models where you would specialize models, and where do you think that's gonna go? It's expensive to build models, of course, but I don't know if what your thought is on that.
Yeah, I think it's accurate that, there are already increasingly specialized models for certain domains. And to some extent, that's going to suffer from, like any area where you try to decide on certain specialties, certain categories, that in fact in the real world these things kind of blend. There are blends between them. But they will be relevant. I think that in most of those cases, though, those specialized models are refinements of a foundation model that gives the system linguistic fluency. So one of the systems that got some press last year was made by Bloomberg, called Bloomberg GPT. And Bloomberg had the advantage of having, 40 years worth of documents, of financial documents. And so they wanted to create an LLM that was specialized in financial information. And they had, unlike most companies, they had a very large volume of data, of content that they were very confident was correct, but they still used a foundation model to give the system linguistic fluency. So what that means is that for most companies, they won't have the volume of data to create their own specialized model, but there will be sector-specific models. And those are, it's going to be a trade-off. They'll have lower linguistic fluency, but that may not be a problem, because often, in some ways, a little bit paradoxically and counterintuitively, the more specialized the domain, the more narrow its vocabulary, and the more consistently its stakeholders speak. In my research about chatbots a few years ago, it was very interesting speaking to a company that specializes in servicing investment firms. So they don't service end consumers making investments. They service traders and brokers and so on. And they use very specialized terminology. So whereas for a consumer-facing bot, you might need to train it on, the 200 ways that a bank customer might say, I need to transfer $50 from checking to savings. With traders and brokers, there are very few ways they say things, because they're professionals who sort of optimized what they say. So it's less important to have sort of a wide net in terms of intent recognition and so on. So I guess I'm answering your question from a bunch of different angles, because this is still very much in motion. But I would predict that there will be many specialized models, but there'll be layers on top of foundation models. And then there'll be layers on top of those and layers on top of those as well. I also suspect, there's some architectures that are based on adversarial models, where you have one model that generates the answer and another one that grades the answer or critiques it. And I could see specialized models being used for that, to score an answer, and if it doesn't score high enough, giving feedback to the generating model and asking it to generate it again before showing it to the end user. All, in a fraction of a second, of course. There was another question. Okay, I'll look.
All right, so great. Thank you for the session today, this morning. So you mentioned that the generative AI will always have invariably different responses, would not have very consistent responses. Yes. So I wanted to know your thoughts about the kind of research has gone into, and what kind of outputs you've seen in the differences in the responses. Is that something significant to worry about? Should we be prepared for the surprises, like any response that can come? What do you have to say for that? Unlike the chatbots, who have a more deterministic
Right.
model in the way they respond.
Yes, right. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. With, I mean, the strength of deterministic chatbots that are rules-based is that they never say anything inaccurate. They do say things that are irrelevant or unhelpful, or and that can be frustrating. But they don't assert inaccurate things. Whereas with ChatGPT and other Gen AI systems, they're never totally irrelevant. They're usually somewhere in the ballpark, or they seem very relevant, but might be totally inaccurate. So it's like it's a trade-off. And I forgot the second part of your question. What was it? So
no, you answered it completely.
Okay.
Like I mentioned that unlike the chatbots, we have like the temperature set, so the
Right.
response difference is not very varied, and
Right.
it would still stay in the same
Yeah.
domain. And
yeah, exactly. And so the way to reducing the temperature to 0 means less variation and less likelihood that it would wander off down an statistically unlikely path that would generate an answer that is completely off the mark. It's still possible that it would, but it's much less likely. So, but usually the reason people are interested in Gen AI is because of its fluency, which is partly because of that creativity. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. Yes.
I came in, so I don't know if somebody asked you this question about the data quality. What do we need to do to make sure that we have good data, is available, is accurate? Do we need to implement, customer data platforms, data clouds? We have so many dispersed systems, so many CRM systems, and we need to tackle that data. I'm talking just, data that is in the different system, but the videos and everything. Especially if we're thinking specialized conversational AI, large language models.
We did touch on that somewhat, but I guess I would just add that, so there are various ways to address that. To some extent, it depends on the nature of the data. For example, if it's image data, saying a sentence is accurate is a meaningful thing, but saying an image is accurate is a little bit of a floatier concept. Maybe the caption would be accurate for the image. So the probs are different depending on what medium you're talking about, what content type you're talking about. But yes, as we did touch on this, that, and I mentioned it this morning, that data cleanliness and data management become really, really crucial, especially because the consequences of an error get very magnified when you're automating things. So yeah, more important than ever. Yeah. So there are lots of tools for doing that. My role here today isn't really to comment on tools and their pros and cons, but there are tools for doing that. Using AI to clean the data, I don't know. I'm not sure how you would do that. If it could be done, that sounds interesting, but I'm not aware of any way to do that. Yep.
So somewhat of an extension of what he asked, I was focusing on the corpus, that you said in the morning, especially the lawsuit about the Getty images. So when you think about is LLMs by very nature needs a large corpus size to be useful, but at the same time, the most of the information available probably will have some kind of IP or some kind of stuff involved. So how do we see coming out of that where I can have LLMs which are really valuable across domain, trained on a corpus which will not violate. I mean, as I think more, I'm just wondering how are we going to come out of that? Any thoughts?
So your question is about how to deal with the fact that when you're creating a corpus, you want to make sure that there aren't intellectual property ownership issues, and how.
Taking an LLM from outside, not my own data. My own
Right.
data I have a control over.
Yep. Yeah.
But if I'm purchasing an LLM from outside.
From someone else, yeah. So that's so that would be a question of trust in the provider and what guarantees they are presenting. I had some interesting conversations last October. I was at Adobe's annual conference, Adobe Max, at which they announced, in addition to Adobe Firefly, which you may be familiar with, I mentioned this morning, is their image generating model, and they announced new models. They announced Image 2, which is the new version for generating images, but also models for generating video, for generating vector graphics, and for generating 3D assets as well. And they just announced that they were doing this. And later I was speaking with some of their executives and asked them, so that must be a considerable investment because Adobe already had Adobe stock, 300 million images that they could use as a corpus for that. But in terms of 3D assets, they didn't have any obvious stock, right? Vector graphics also not much to speak of. So what that means is that Adobe, like a lot of companies, was quietly trying to acquire, buy the rights to, or license the rights to a lot of these assets very quickly, which means that the market for assets that could be used for training models is, is very hot right now and could be going up. But in making that decision, you're going to want to be very careful about the provider. So for example, Stability AI, well, they're having other problems right now because of their CEO and so on. But if even before that that's only happened in the last few weeks. But over the past year, since Getty, initiated the $1.8 trillion lawsuit against them, I can't understand why any company would be doing business with Stability AI, knowing that they were under the shadow of this enormous lawsuit. I mean, super creative company in terms of the research and the technology, but somebody apparently was not thinking when they trained it on these images, to the point where when you generate an image with Stable Diffusion, you'll see the Getty logo kind of smeared into the image, because as far as the model is concerned, they're just more pixels that are part of the images, right? So that's super high risk. Fine as an academic project, as part of somebody's PhD, but not as a company, it seems to me. So, sure. Yes.
So I think that at this point, to really get the benefits of generative AI, you have to have an idea of how it's working. So in that sense, the slides that you presented this morning are absolutely great, because you do not need a very strong technical background to understand that. Unfortunately, none of my colleagues were here, and I would like them to have a little bit more data literacy. I think that's really critical. That also explains a bit of the resistance that we see, and also sometimes overinflated expectations, because people do not know about the limitations and how things really work. So I'm just curious to see whether you've seen any specific approaches or things that you would recommend when it comes about promoting the right level of data, rather AI literacy across organization.
It's a good question. So how to promote AI literacy so that people don't get sort of taken in and have too much trust or the wrong kinds of trust in the system. I think it seems to me what that comes down to is explaining what the system does, not whether or not it uses AI. Because there is this movement afoot, some people who think, well, we should label any system that uses AI. I think that's the wrong approach, because it's, AI is an ingredient. It's kind of like saying, this website uses a database. Ooh, scary. Well, that's a technology component, and there are different flavors of AI, and there are different ways of using AI. It's a little bit like Intel Inside on your laptop. Most people really didn't care that it was Intel Inside. It was a marketing thing for Intel. But similarly, AI Inside as a warning, I think, would be very misleading. What is important, though, is for users to be really clear on what the reliability of the system is, what it's intended for. So, for example, as I showed this morning, the slide of the homepage of OpenAI, which does say, it's in small print, but it does say the system may generate incorrect, inaccurate, toxic, harmful, no, it doesn't say toxic, but harmful, biased, counterfactual results, So they're being honest about that. And I think that needs to flow right through to systems that companies are deploying that are not just a research project. Now, OpenAI can afford to use those kind of tough words because they call it just a research project. If you're interacting, say, with Bank of America, and their bot told you that it might generate inaccurate results or maybe harmful results, you would probably back off right away, not use it, right? So that presents kind of a conundrum, which means I guess it just underscores the point I was trying to make, which is that GenAI is not ready for those real-time interactions with end customers. It can be used for for retrieval augmented generation, for RAG in some cases, where at least it's still not 100%, but it's much better, where you might be willing to trust it. But in a lot of cases, it's not really ready. Make sense? Other questions before I go back to you for a second one? Oh, well, you already asked a question too, so you get to go again, Kyle.
Right. So in the morning, you said one of the misconceptions about AI is that it is biased, which it's really not. It's the data, the corpus that it can ingest that is biased. When making a custom LLM, how can we mitigate the bias in that? I know it's almost impossible to do it for the large the LLMs like ChatGPT and everything. I mean, 500 million tokens is impossible to sift through. But at a customized one, how can we mitigate the bias? We can't probably eliminate it, but how do we mitigate it?
Yeah. So a good example of doing that is the system that I showed this morning. I showed a screenshot of Adobe Firefly. And you may recall, if you looked at that slide carefully, the prompt I typed into the bottom was, I asked it to make an image of a doctor dressed in green speaking to a nurse dressed in blue. And I did that very specifically. I said green and blue, so you could definitely distinguish the two. Otherwise, they might just be two people wearing scrubs. And if you looked carefully, you may have noticed that unlike, I guess we don't really need this on, but I'll hit it just in case. So obviously, Adobe Firefly is trained on images that historically reflect biases and statistical patterns in employment patterns, such as the fact that on the whole there are more male doctors and female nurses. So you might have expected it to generate in all 4 candidate images a male doctor and a female nurse, but it did not. And this is because Adobe has taken very specific measures to eliminate or reduce bias in the content that Adobe Firefly generates. And in fact, if you look carefully, you'll see there's much more diversity in terms of both gender and ethnicity in the images that they generate. And the way they do that is they didn't go back through the 300 million images and edit them and reshoot and so on. What they're doing is modifying the context. In other words, giving guidance in addition to the prompt that I gave. They're injecting some additional words for the system ahead of what I said, guiding it to ensure that it's representative, choosing images of people who are reflecting gender diversity and ethnic diversity in the output. So that's a way you can sort of shape and steer the LLM even if you don't have a corpus that's really clean. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely.
Sure. We have about 5 minutes left. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
Is there a way you can share the presentation from the morning?
Share the presentation from the morning. I think probably Kore is sharing PDFs of the presentations. Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
So data volumes are going to be a huge impact on the generative AI. Data volumes, data volumes, right? Not everybody is going to use that level of LLMs. I know there's a chip shortage too. Where do you see the industry going in terms of compute, in terms of actually cloud, and then a reverse on-prem in terms of how people are using their cloud, right? Technology and compute. Where do you see that going from a Gen AI perspective?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on cloud versus on-prem. But I think one thing I'll say just related to that is that one of the big dilemmas is about the computational expense of LLMs. And there are various strategies for getting around that, such as pre-computing certain results and caching them, or in some cases using a cheaper LLM as actually, this is not something I've seen anybody doing yet, but I predict this will happen, that essentially companies will use different LLMs as sort of a little bit like a tiered service in a contact center, where the first tier might be the less expensive LLM, and if it can't satisfy the customer, you would get escalated to an LLM that might cost 100 times as much, and therefore that the company could not deploy for everyone, but would deploy for those escalations. And the escalation might be due to inability to resolve, or it might be due to the decision to offer white glove service to a VIP customer. So there would be tiering of LLMs in the same way that we have tiering of employees, where we have the premium expert people who have 20 years of experience are never the first line people answering the phone, but you can escalate to them. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's adjacent, so I'm offering that. Right. Yep. Yes. Yep. Yep. I'm getting the signal that it's time to wrap up. So thanks for all your good questions. I can stick around for 5 minutes longer if anybody wants to talk one-on-one, but thank you.